All right, welcome Unsecurity Podcast listeners. This is episode 172 of the Unsecurity Podcast. The date is Tuesday, April 26th. Hope you're having a good week so far. No Brad again today, so yeah, I know you guys miss him, but he'll be back. He's doing fine. Just you know, busy, 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 busy. So you get me today, uh, and the marketing team gave me some pretty good things to talk about. They want to talk about multi-factor authentication. And one of the questions they pose is, we preach multi-factor authentication as an essential security measure, but how can you ensure that multi-factor authentication is in place and it's actually secure? So multi-factor authentication, I think a lot of people, you've got security folks and you've got other folks, right? And a lot of us use multi-factor authentication on a pretty regular basis. We understand the importance of it. I think in general, less than half of the entire population, employs multi-factor authentication. Certainly not in all the places where it's available. It's available on probably all of your banking sites, your financial services sites, uh, Google, all the big tech sites, Twitter, Facebook, Amazon, they all have multi-factor authentication capabilities, and you should turn them on. But one of the news articles that was sent my way comes from Wired magazine, and the title of the article is "A Sinister Way to Beat Multi-Factor Authentication is on the Rise," and the subtitle is "Lapsus and the group behind the SolarWinds attack have utilized prompt bombing to defeat weaker multi-factor authentication protections in recent months." So first off, we'll start with what is multi-factor authentication. We sort of take it for granted. Everybody's, if you're a security person, you're like, yeah, I know what it is. But multi-factor authentication, you know, take, your other family members or your neighbors, um, your parents. Do they know what multi-factor authentication is? So I'll just explain it really quick. There are three factors involved in authentication. And before you even get to authentication, you have to profess an identity. So you have identity first. That's usually a username. Um, so my name is, Evan Francine. It might be E Francine. It might be my username for any specific, access to an application. So that's an identity. Your identity is by itself, there's no proof that you actually are who you say you are. That's where authentication comes into play. There are three factors or sort of types of authentication we can use. The first one is something you know, and that would be like a password, a PIN code, uh, something that you keep secret that only you should know, that you haven't shared with anybody else. That's what's called type one. That's one factor of authentication. Another factor of authentication or type of authentication is something you have. So it might be a phone, it might be a hardware token, any number of things you might have. It might be a smart card. So that's type two. Uh, that's another factor of authentication. The third factor of authentication is something you are, and that's biometrics. So it might be a fingerprint, it might be voice recognition, it might be a retina scan, it might be hand geometry. There's all kinds of different things that are unique to you that could serve as an authenticator, proving your identity to a system. And once the system is satisfied, depending on how it's been configured, and you've authenticated with that system, the next thing that happens is authorization. You get a certain privileges, to the system, logging in and what files you can access, settings you can change, all that kind of stuff. So those are the three factors of authentication. Some might argue that there's a fourth factor, which is somewhere you are, using geolocation. But traditionally, three factors. It's something you know, something you have, and something you are. So that's those are the three factors. Now, when we talk about multi-factor authentication, you take two of those and put them together to authenticate with the system. So single factor authentication might just be my password. Multi-factor authentication might be my password, and then I get a text or an email or some code on a dongle that I enter in for that second factor of authentication. Now, what people don't, I think, realize is every time you go to the ATM machine, you're using multi-factor authentication, and which is, when you're explaining it to, non-technical folks, I think it helps them understand it better. But when you go to the ATM machine, you have something your PIN number, your PIN code, and something you have, the card itself. So that is multi-factor authentication to allow you to take cash out of that cash machine. So here, according to Wired Magazine, there's a sinister way to beat multi-factor authentication, and it's becoming more and more common. And what it's called prompt bombing. And what prompt bombing is I would authenticate with a system, and then the second factor would be maybe an application, an authentication application on my phone. It might even be an email. And the first time the user gets that prompt, so you would log in, you type in your password, and then you'd get a prompt saying, hey, the second factor, do you want to allow this to, allow this access? The user the first time, might be on that this must be a scam, or maybe they just ignore it, or, didn't even notice it. But the attacker continues to do it until the user gets tired of seeing it and they just click the OK button and just get rid of it. At that point, the attacker has that second factor and can log in as you. So they assume your identity with the system and get your authorizations with the system, and they can do what they want from there. So yeah, this is pretty common. Now, a good buddy of mine, very good buddy of mine, Roger Grimes, who works down at I'm trying to remember the name. KnowBe4. Sorry. Roger Grimes, good friend of mine down at KnowBe4. Awesome security practitioner, been around forever. I don't know how many books he's written, 13, 14, 15 books. A couple of years ago, him and Kevin Mitnick, who's KnowBe4's chief hacking officer, devised or discovered or documented 12 ways to defeat multi-factor authentication, and that kind of became viral. So Roger, took that and went and spoke at the RSA conference, and a whole bunch of other things. So there are ways to defeat multi-factor authentication. So then you have some of us in our industry who are like, well, if you can defeat multi-factor authentication, it must not be secure. And I would argue that that's not the point. The point is not risk elimination. That's impossible. That's a game you and I cannot win. The game is risk management. So is it less risky for me to use multi-factor authentication than it is to use single-factor authentication? The answer is a resounding yes. Can multi-factor authentication be hacked? That's also a resounding yes. And truly everything can be hacked. Anything, everything can be hacked. So you're never hack proof. And that's one of the things I think as a user, just because you're using multi-factor authentication does not mean you're immune to being attacked, to losing your identity, to losing money, to losing access to something. So you still have to remain diligent. You have to pay attention. If you notice something that's off, well, something is off. Computers only do what you tell them to do. So if the computer is running differently, or you notice that settings have changed, somebody changed it. So, pay attention. Now for this prompt bombing attack, read the prompts. There's a reason why you're getting those prompts over and over again. If you're not initiating it, somebody else is, or you have an application that's maybe malfunctioning, uh, that's causing it, but something is causing it. And what we don't want to do is just ignore it or just say, well, I don't know what it is. I'm just going to, I got to get on with my day. You're asking for it, when you do something like that. So Roger Grimes, if you just look up his name, Roger Grimes, and MFA, you'll come up with his research and his articles. But there are many ways to attack things. Certainly, multi-factor authentication, and just 6 of them, maybe off the top of my head, that are pretty common. You've got man in the endpoint attacks. That's where who you're actually authenticating with. You think you're authenticating with legitimate system, but you're actually authenticating with a compromised system. So during that type of an attack, so if I were an attacker, I would attack the authenticator itself, and that's how I would get access to your account. That's one way to bypass or attack multi-factor authentication. Now, there's not much you can do from a user perspective unless you're paying attention again, and you notice that things just seem a little bit off. Maybe I got prompted for my credentials twice, when normally I just get prompted once, or maybe it's much slower than it usually is. Those are all indications that something might be wrong. Another type of an attack is called a SIM swapping attack. A SIM swapping attack. So in your phone is a SIM card. Now we've gotten away from hardware SIM cards a lot more, and now it's integrated or software SIM cards where you can change. And what the SIM does is it essentially identifies you on the carrier's network. So when a phone call comes into the carrier knows how to route it to your phone and make it ring. Now, what an attacker would do in a SIM swapping attack is this would be a text-based, usually an SMS-based MFA attack. So this is where the second factor is the phone, and the way that factor works is you get a text after you type in your username and PIN, or username and password. So what an attacker can do is call the phone company, uh, convince the phone company that they are you. So it's a social engineering attack, and claim that you got a new phone. You lost your phone. You're not sure what happened. So can you? And I've got a new phone sitting here on my desk right now. Can you send me a new SIM card for it? And if you're convincing enough, you might get the carrier to send you a new SIM card. And when that happens, you insert the SIM card, and now the attacker gets the second factor. Now, one of the things here that users again need to be paying attention is when a new SIM card is activated on your account, chances are really, really good that the old SIM card is deactivated, meaning your phone won't work anymore in a SIM swapping attack, but the attacker essentially has your phone. That's another way to attack multi-factor authentication. Other SMS-based MFA or multi-factor authentication attacks, duplicate code generator attacks, which would be um, sometimes code the software that generates the codes for the second factor. One really common code generator is take Google Authenticator, for instance. Now, it's not susceptible to a duplicate or a predictable code generation, but other less secure implementations of multi-factor are. And this is where an attacker would either guess, predict, or they have the algorithm for the code generator, and they know what the code is going to be for that second factor. So this is, the Okta attack. I don't know if you remember years ago, the RSA attack where the source code was stolen. And that meant that the algorithm for how RSA tokens were generating uh, the codes was also known to attackers. So they had to go through the expense of replacing all of those um, tokens. That's a duplicate code generator attack. Uh, you have account password recovery attacks where sometimes uh, if it's implemented poorly, I can say that I forgot my password and go through the proper, I guess, usually recovery questions or recovery information that I need to provide. And if that's implemented poorly or insecurely, that's another way to potentially bypass multi-factor authentication. And then you've certainly got shared authentication types of attacks and attacking APIs, stuff like that. So the point here is multi-factor authentication is more secure always than single-factor authentication, but it's not secure in the sense where you've eliminated the risk. That's not possible. So don't even think it's possible. It doesn't really matter what you do because there's usually vulnerabilities, weaknesses in systems come in one of two flavors. It's usually an insecure configuration, so it was an oversight by somebody who installed something, or it's a software flaw. Um, and on average, maybe somewhere between 5, maybe and 10 errors in software per 1,000 lines of code. And to put that in, and we call that a K-log. So to put that in perspective, um, like maybe Windows, I'm not sure how many millions of lines of code it is anymore, but I think Windows 8 was maybe 5 million lines of code. So if you do the math, there's quite a few software flaws, and they're a pretty good software shop. So that's the deal. So multi-factor authentication, yes, use it wherever you possibly can. Uh, Identifying vulnerable multi-factor authentication systems, they're all vulnerable to some extent. Us as users, when we're using multi-factor authentication, it's really about paying attention. Situational awareness is key. It's critical to protecting ourselves physically and electronically. So, and eliminating vulnerabilities in multi-factor authentication systems, you really can't eliminate all of them. Uh, there are some multi-factor authentication mechanisms that are more secure than others. I think arguably the most secure method of multi-factor authentication is using a dedicated security device, something like a YubiKey. If you've never heard of a YubiKey before, it's UBIKEY. Another one is Thetis, THETIS. Those are very secure methods of receiving multi-factor authentication codes. So you'll receive it securely, right? So the attacker is probably not going to be able to intercept that code generation, but it's also not going to protect you from an insecure configuration with who you're authenticating with either. So even that will still have vulnerabilities, and that's key, paying attention again. But those are probably the most secure methods of receiving a multi-factor authentication code. Now, there's been a lot of work going on for a number of years. One of those is the FIDO Alliance. The FIDO Alliance is, who is it, Microsoft, Firefox, or Mozilla, Google, Apple. They all got together to try to create a better authentication method and authentication protocol. Duo is part of that too. I mean, there are quite a few there. Two things that they're trying to do. One is to just kill passwords off. So there's something you know, just no longer make it a thing. Um, so you have to authenticate with something, either something you are or something you have. And FIDO uses really both of those. You can get pretty technical. There are new protocols or newer protocols with FIDO. And if you go to FIDO Alliance, FIDO alliance.org, you can read all about FIDO. WebAuthn and CTAP are two new protocols. CTAP is client to authentication protocol or client to authenticator protocol, just a secure method of sharing authentication information. It's interesting. It'll be interesting to see where FIDO ends up, because on one side they're working on the better, more secure authentication, and then on another piece, really it's about single sign-on. So logging in one time, and for secure members within the ecosystem, they'll share your authentication information, so you don't need to authenticate with every place you go visit. There'll be a shared authentication. Now, this also will have weaknesses. This also will be hackable. Everything is hackable. Um, there's no exceptions to that. That's just the way the world works. So FIDO's interesting. I encourage you to go check that out. And use multi-factor. So it's kind of funny how us in this industry, when we see, oh my gosh, multi-factor authentication has been hacked, and we're all surprised by it, like, oh, see, I guess multi-factor authentication doesn't work. Well, that you missed the point completely. Multi-factor authentication isn't supposed to be hack proof. It was never supposed to be hack proof. It's supposed to reduce risk to a level that you feel comfortable with. Nobody should feel comfortable just using passwords, single factor authentication. Um, and, depending on how much you want to get into the details, you know, different types of multi factor authentication, might work better for you, but just turn it on, take advantage of it wherever you can, and expect that's going to get hacked. So pay attention. All right, that's that. I've sort of beat that up. Hopefully, the marketing team is happy with me on how I covered that. I know I talked fast, but this is a podcast, so you can rewind, go forward again. You can probably go half speed. I don't know, whatever you want. I got two just kind of short news things to cover. One that caught my attention was Lapsus again, because we just talked about Lapsus in the Wired article. Lapsus is also in a HackRead article about stealing T-Mobile's source code and systems data. There you go. T-Mobile. This isn't T-Mobile's first rodeo. They've been hacked multiple times in the past. Everybody is susceptible, just like everything is susceptible to an attack or to a compromise. Same with every company. But here, the Lapsus group, they stole T-Mobile source code in March 2022, so that was pretty recent, last month, and that was before some of them were arrested. Downloaded reportedly or allegedly over 30,000 source code repositories of the carrier. That's a heck of a lot of code. I'm not sure how many gigabytes that is, but that's a lot of code. And T-Mobile, they stated that their monitoring tools detected the unauthorized access, trying to get into the internal systems using stolen credentials. However, their response wasn't really prompt, and the hackers' Lapsus had been in their systems for a while. So here is now with T-Mobile, we just talked about SIM swapping attacks. This could hurt T-Mobile users who are relying upon T-Mobile phones for that second factor of authentication. So if you are a T-Mobile user, pay attention. Maybe it makes sense to reach out to T-Mobile and ask them what the impact is for you. Yeah, but anyway, lapsus in the news again. Now the last one I have is another ransomware gang you've probably not heard of before. This is Stormous, Stormous. They claim to have hacked Coca-Cola. So there you go. Now, Stormous or Stormouse or Store, whatever you want to call them, they're a ransomware gang. So they're not really known for exfiltrating data so much, but that's kind of where ransomware is going. If an organization has pretty good recovery, pretty good recovery options, they won't pay the ransom. So what the attackers then have done is they exfiltrate the data and hold it for extortion. So if you don't pay the ransom, then we'll release the data. And we've seen that numerous times in FRSecure's incident responses. So pretty common. So here, allegedly 161 gigabytes of data was stolen by Stormhouse, and they posted, on the dark web that, hey, here's some bragging rights, and yeah. Anyway, I'm not sure what took place after that in terms of whether Coca-Cola, paid the ransom, capitulated or not. So the learning lesson there is, well, one, you certainly have the recovery. You want to avoid the business disruption as much as possible. On the other side, if they've exfiltrated data, that's going to be a risk decision that the organization is going to have to make on whether they want to or pay the extortion and actually believe that the attacker won't still release the data. Sometimes you just have to cut your losses on the data that was stolen and go through the breach notification process and all those goodies. All right, so that's all I've got. We're at about 27 minutes. I'm hoping Brad will be back next week. It's good to talk to somebody. If Brad isn't back next week, maybe I'll invite Oscar. I like talking to Oscar. He's got that cool Southern drawl. Maybe I'll invite Ryan. I'm not sure, but we'll see. We'll see what we have in store for next week. I will give a shout out. I'll give a shout out to the entire FRSecure team. I'm really, 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 really proud of everybody at FRSecure. Yesterday, we had an all company, once a quarter, we do the all company meeting where we go over, how the quarter went and, celebrate our successes, try to minimize, certainly our failures. We don't want to dwell on those, but honestly, every single thing that came out of that meeting was positive. They're just killing it. They're serving customers really, really well. The mission is 100% on track. I mentioned the marketing team here on the podcast, how they give me and Brad topics to talk about in the podcast. They're amazing. For FRSecure to market the way they do with integrity, right? It's not, making false promises and using buzzwords. It's awesome marketing. So I guess if I was going to give a shout out to any one person, maybe it'd be Andy, the head of marketing at FRSecure, but he's supported too by, Nick, who's just amazing. Brandon, also amazing. But anyway, they did such a good job on the CISSP mentor program that I believe the number was 10,364 registrations for the FRSecure CISSP mentor program this year. It's 13th year, and serving 65 different countries. So 10,364 registrations from 65 different countries. That's absolutely outstanding. So that's it. That's episode 162. We'll talk to you next week.